Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast. I have Andy Smith. He's a research and teaching farm manager, part of Kwantlen University. He works on sustainable agriculture and food systems. So we're going to talk about his work and ask him some questions. So, Andy, thank you for coming.
Yeah, glad to be here.
If you would, tell me a bit about your background first. How did you get into looking at sustainable agriculture?
Yeah, I did a degree in business administration back in California and then did a number of years of community development work, primarily in India, actually, and was working in urban settings, basically in urban squatter communities. And a lot of my friends and neighbors there had recently, or within the last 15 years and less, had migrated from their home villages into the city to look for better work, but were also driven because of the inability to continue farming in the way that they had been in their home villages. And so was able to kind of witness this, this rural to urban migration happen in the community that I was living in. And it just got me thinking about what are the reasons that rural communities are emptying out in so many cases and the challenges associated with that, both for the individuals experiencing that migration as well as for our society as a whole. And just got me curious about what it would look like to help make rural communities a bit more resilient and able to continue farming and to have more small landholders rather than when we see rural areas empty out, oftentimes that coincides with a lot of, accumulation land in fewer and fewer hands. And so...
is this what you're working on right now, or is this in the past?
No, just in the past. And so it just got me, as I was starting to see some of the issues associated with rural populations and in India, I thought, well, I would be interested to learn about farming and what's actually involved in farming. What are some of the challenges that farmers are facing. And so when I moved to Canada, I got a job at a small scale farm that was run out of an environmental conservation organization in South Surrey, British Columbia, and worked there for a number of years before coming here to Kwantlen Polytechnic. And yeah, so it's been an interesting, as I got into farming, I realized, this is actually quite an interesting area of work.
A couple of questions about the old project. What were some of the reasons why rural communities weren't sustainable and people moved out and didn't farm anymore?
Yeah, I think there were a number of reasons that we heard from folks. One was just as the population grows, then these land holdings are divided among more and more people. And so those, each family, as the generations go on, each family has less and less land to farm. And when using a more conventional farming method that's larger scale, it becomes untenable quite quickly if you only have, a couple of acres to farm. I had heard about other systems where people were farming intensively on smaller scale holdings. And so that kind of piqued my interest. I think another significant reason in India was just the general environmental degradation and the loss of fertility and also water scarcity issues. And so I think that was a significant piece, as well as just, it's very challenging to make any significant living as a small scale farmer in much of the world, including in North America.
Well, I saw a show about the Pani Foundation, which means water, in India, and they did a lot of rainwater collection with swales and things like that. And that enabled the people in these areas not to become migrant workers when things dried up.
Yes.
Did anyone suggest to these rural communities to do more permaculture type stuff, more regenerative agriculture, but maybe first to retain more rainwater so that they could do those kind of things?
Yeah, I wasn't actually involved much with the rural communities. I was basically interacting with folks that had already migrated into the city. And so I don't have a lot of familiarity with that, but I know there are a number of organizations working with small scale farmers all over to address some of those issues. And there are a lot of ways, obviously, to address them.
So what is the current work that you're doing today?
Yeah, so I am the farm manager for a teaching and research farm that's associated with our university's Bachelor of Science in Sustainable Agriculture. And so all of our students that come through our program have classes that pretty much all of our classes have, some lecture and then some hands-on components. And we have a class in particular that runs from January through December that's all hands-on on the farm. And so we really look at the farm that I manage as kind of the lab part of our program, in the same way that a biology or chemistry science student would have significant time in the lab. We ensure that our students get some time on the farm, actually understanding both how to manage a farm from a logistics and financial standpoint, as well as to understand the farm as an ecosystem. So looking at how both the cash crops and plants that aren't, that are just part of the farm ecosystem can parts that it's not just the produce that we're pulling into the farmer's market that's important, like looking at the farm as an integrated whole. And so, so we have opportunities for students to do a pretty deep dive in actually getting some hands-on experience here. And then there's also research that students would do on the farm. And so I help coordinate that as well.
Well, what are they learning about being on the farm? Do you have a curriculum, or are they just kind of anecdotally learn things, or what are they working on?
Yeah, so kind of the really significant course that runs from January through December. Students are here 2 days a week, and there are kind of set teaching times looking at plant physiology or looking at the pests that we're observing on the farm and talking through how we can address those things. And so there are specific things that are taught on the farm or in those courses, as well as it's kind of a learning by doing and by having exposure to the system for students to get a sense of what's involved in growing the produce that we all see on our grocery shelves. What are some of the challenges? What are things that are relatively straightforward? So I think it's really an opportunity for for students to literally get their hands dirty, but also to have quite a bit of exposure. A lot of farming programs or agricultural programs actually have no requirement to be on a farm in the summer when we grow food in North America. And so a lot of students in other programs can graduate from an agricultural program without any actual hands-on experience. And so we really try and marry the kind of traditional science pieces of plant physiology and soil science and those pieces with actually, okay, what does this look like in the field, and actually being able to observe it and do some of that thinking process in the field.
Okay, so I mean, what specific skills or things are you doing? Soil growing just outside? Are you doing hydroponics? There's certain plants that you're growing that for food. What does it look like?
Yep. So we grow we've got about 3 acres in cultivation, and it's a mixed vegetable operation. So we grow, probably 40 or 50 different varieties of vegetables. We grow a lot of it just out in the field. And we have a few movable high tunnels, which are like a greenhouse structure that is actually on track. So it allows us to extend the season. So we can be growing in one plot in the spring and then move to a second plot for the summer and move to a third plot for the fall. And so even in a system like that, we're trying to help our students think through how to efficiently use space and financial resources to only have, just as an example, like in this case, plant protection in the form of a greenhouse to you only need that for certain crops at certain times of the year. So to introduce our students to thinking about, again, as a system, if you're able to grow food, vegetables year round, which vegetables are going to need that protection during which parts of the year, and then being able to kind of see that in a hands-on way. And then this farm that I manage is in kind of fairly early stages of development. This is about the 4th year that we've growing vegetables here, and the next year too we'll also be adding orchard, both freestanding trees as well as trellised orchards, and like raspberries and other kinds of bush fruit to give students exposure to some of those production systems as well, recognizing that those systems are quite distinct from growing vegetables or greenhouse growing. So we really want our students to be able to interact with quite a few different production systems, knowing that our students are going to go into lots of different areas after they graduate.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Okay, so what are some of the current learnings or research ideas or questions that you have in the main about what you're doing?
Yeah, so there are our students are also involved in a 3-semester research program, and so they will come up with a research idea, carry it out on the farm in the summer, and then kind of collect their findings and present that. And so there's always really interesting projects that students come up with on that in a whole range of areas. So no-till farming is generating a lot of interest certainly right now, and in terms of both protecting soil health as well as minimizing disturbance to the soils, which helps with carbon retention in the soil, carbon dioxide, so that there's less carbon dioxide coming out of the soil. And so one of our students was quite interested in no-till systems, but there's not a lot and no-till systems are used quite widely in large-scale agriculture and some of our commodity crops, but in a smaller scale vegetable farm, they're not as widely used, and there's some particular challenges in that. And so he went through a process of looking at various no-till methods looked at how does this impact plant growth, these different methods, how does it impact the time, both for weed control as well as for planting versus tilling and overall plant health. And so I think he's still in the process of putting his findings together, but that's an example of the kind of research that might happen. Another student was quite interested in minimizing the amount of peat that we use in our propagation mix. So peat, although it's a natural product, is formed over such a long, it grows so slowly that essentially
what is peat?
Peat moss is what's often used. It's from a plant called sphagnum moss, which grows in mostly northern climate. So there's a lot of peat that grows, and it grows in like peat bogs, right? That's why the name peat's there. And so it's this very slow growing moss, and it grows about 1 millimeter a year. So to get a meter worth of peat, and it accumulates over time, it just keeps building up and up. And so there are areas in northern Canada where you might have peat that's 4 or 5 meters deep, and so you think, oh wow, there's a lot here, but that represents millennia of growth and development of that. And so what happens now for a lot of greenhouse seedling production is that peat is taken out and put in soil mixes, because it's almost like a sponge. It really holds water really well, but it's nice and fluffy as well. So those new roots of seedlings are able to move through it quite easily, and it holds that moisture that the seedling needs at a young stage. And so it's used as part of our potting mixes in growing seedlings and in nurseries and that kind of thing.
Are you using it as like cover crop, or are you using it as just potting?
No, it's not it's like a dry product. So you just add it into a potting mix, or a lot of the potting mixes that one could buy at Home Depot or something would have peat as the base of that mix. And
in order for it to grow, does it have to be in a wetland? Or can it grow in drier conditions? And can it be used, again, in its living form instead of a dried form?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, no, it's a pretty adapted species to wetlands. So it can tolerate standing water, and it grows in a much more acidic environment than a lot of plants, which wetlands tend to be quite a bit more acidic. And so it kind of, sphagnum peat moss really kind of inhabits this particular niche within the wider ecosystem, and grows where a lot of other plants wouldn't be able to grow. But if you just took that plant and planted it in a field, it would just dry out. It doesn't even. We are experimenting actually with transplanting some sphagnum from one part of a bog that's quite close to our farm to another bog that's just nearby, and seeing if we can propagate it in that way. But it's quite finicky to propagate. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, I understand. So you're using it in a dried form. So what have you noticed it does to the potting soil mix? How much better do the plants grow? What's different?
Oh, yeah. So having the peat moss as part of a potting mix is like the industry standard. That's what is used all over. So one of our students was interested to know if there would be a way to get away from using peat moss in our potting mix, and if there were some alternatives. So she looked at using spent mushroom manure, which is the substrate that mushrooms grow in a commercial setting. So the mushroom growers will take straw from chicken barns that has some chicken manure in it. And so it's quite a bit of straw. And then they also will use some peat to grow. But then after the mushrooms grow out of that substrate, then they end up just getting rid of that. It's like a waste product. And so our student's question was, well, is there a way to take this waste product and actually incorporate it into our potting mix and have that be a replacement for the peat that we're buying and that's being mined from these virgin peat fields? And so
but so again, but what are the effects of having peat in the potting soil? How beneficial is it? And, could farms have a small section where they are actively growing peat and harvesting it a little bit every year for use in the soil?
No, I don't think that would work.
Is it too slow or what?
Yeah, both it's too slow and you can't. Basically, what you're harvesting is all this. You could kind of think of it as like dead leaves or dead branches further down the stem. It's a very small plant, but all the stuff that's below the top of the growing point. And so when it's harvested commercially, they're just taking out huge sections of it. And I think most farms wouldn't have have a location on their farm where it would even take necessarily. A lot of where the peat that we're using in our farming systems is coming from northern areas where there isn't other forms of agriculture happening. Yeah.
Again, has anyone compared soil potting mix with and without peat, and how much of a difference does it make? Is it dramatic
exactly.
or just a little?
Yeah, so that was our students' question was, okay, is there a way to get peat out of the potting mix, and what are some alternatives? So she used this mushroom manure and then she did some that was just a straight peat. She had a couple variations, and she found that just removing all the peat from the mix and just having the mushroom manure along with some nutrient amendments actually did have a pretty significant negative impact on the plant growth. But having a 50-50 blend of peat and this mushroom manure, the plants actually did even better than the kind of the traditional potting mix that we had been using. So it allowed us as a farm to source a waste product basically for free from a mushroom farm and reduce how much peat we're buying, and also would be an opportunity for other growers to do the same if they're making their own propagation mix.
What about mycorrhizae inoculants to the soil? Has anyone looked at that?
Yeah, certainly that's an area of interest. We haven't been looking at, or we haven't done any research on our farm about that, but that's certainly one of the main reasons to go to a no-till system, like what I was talking about before, is that it helps preserve some of the mycorrhizal networks that are in the soil. And if you're coming through with heavy equipment and heavily disturbing that soil, it's going to be breaking up all those very delicate filaments. But yeah, I think there's a whole lot of it's a huge area of gaps in our understanding, certainly in our science. There's so much happening with mushrooms and mycelium that we are just kind of beginning to understand.
Any other modifications to your soil that seem to be working really well? So you mixed, some peat and some of this dry mushroom mix. That seems to work really well. I don't know, have you tried just the mushroom mix without the peat? Does it still work as well? What else are you trying?
Yeah, no, just the mushroom mix without peat. We did notice a decline in the health of the seedlings, and so that was our learning from our students' research of having this blended mix. But in terms of the soil in the field, this site's actually quite an interesting farm, and I would say kind of the farm itself is an experiment in that where we're located in just outside Vancouver, we're on an island that. Most of the island used to be a peat bog and has been drained in different ways and built up into an urban area. And so the site that we're farming on is actually an old bog that was drained but has been kept as agricultural land. And so without going into too much detail, we got onto this property about 7 years ago, but the native soil, the peat soil, was quite heavily contaminated with heavy metals from past use of the site. There had been like a firing range, and so there were heavy metals in some of the gun shells and stuff. As well as if you farm a peat soil, the only way to do that for most crops, most vegetable crops, is because it's a very acidic soil, and most vegetable crops like a pretty neutral soil. So lots of peatlands are farmed, but farmers will put in lots of lime, which brings up the pH and nutrients. And then it ends up being this soil that is quite productive. But because peat is basically 100% or 80% carbon, if you are farming it, you're going to be causing a lot of that peat to break down. And of course, when carbon breaks down, it becomes carbon dioxide and releases greenhouse gas. The carbon dioxide is released from the soil into the atmosphere. So when we had the opportunity to farm this site, we said, okay, well, we can't farm it because of the heavy metals. And also we don't want to farm it just as the peat because of the negative greenhouse gas emissions that would be associated with that. And so we worked with the city, who's the owner of this property, to actually import mineral soil, so soil that doesn't have any organic matter in it, but so it'd just be like sand or clay and didn't have nutrients in it. either. It just it was fill from construction, a big expansion of the airport that was happening nearby. And so when I started about 4 years ago, that soil had just been layered on top of the peat. And basically the intention was to farm in this new soil that we had brought in and permanently sequester the peat and the carbon that was in the peat underneath. And so it was interesting when I first started, it looked like a moonscape because there were no nutrients in the soil. It was really like there was nothing growing. The first year there were hardly even any weeds because the soil had been dug out at a depth where there weren't weed seeds or anything like that. And over the last 3 or 4 years now, by adding lots of compost as well as pretty intensively cover cropping, so using grasses like wheat or rye, as well as legumes like peas or clover, the quality of the soil is really dramatically improved. And it still feels like there's a lot of room for improvement in the soil. Like we started at a pretty low baseline, but it's been really remarkable to see how quickly the soil has really improved and regenerated and gone from this soil where there's very little nutrient as well as very little microbial life, because it was just this. There wouldn't have been anything for the microbes to eat, right? Because there wasn't any organic matter there. And to see it come to life has been really, really interesting. So we're continuing to follow those practices and it's interesting in regenerative ag, what you're basically trying to do is put sunlight and air into the ground, right? So it's the sunlight. When plants photosynthesize it, they're creating nutrients that then and sugars that we are harvesting off of, but then also the residue from those plants are in. And when it's a cover crop, all of that plant is then turned back into the soil, and it provides the kind of the basis of the food chain for the soil life that we're trying to cultivate as well. So
you should tell the students if they use peat more than once to be a repeat customer.
That's right.
Bad joke. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So what theoretically, I don't know, how much of an improvement in yield or other metrics can you get by using this peat mushroom combo, or is there still a while to dial the recipe in for what you really want?
Yeah, so the peat mushroom combo is really that's really just in our propagation mix. So we looked at overall seedling health rather than so it's just kind of at the first stage of our production system. So after our plants are transplanted in the field, then they're in a soil system. They're not just dependent on that mix that we've created. So it'd be a bit different than quite different than a aquaponic type, or not aquaponic, hydroponic type system where they're going to be in a container and just getting a nutrient solution. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Where can people find out more about the work you're doing? And I don't know if you're looking for volunteers or people that people that are local, but again, where can people contact you best?
Yeah, so it's best to check out our website, which is kpu.ca/agriculture. And there they can find information both about the farm that I've been describing, as well as the program, the bachelor's program that we have. Certainly, if people are local, you can also find information there about how to come and visit. And we really love having people come out to the farm. And it's quite a unique site, being we're right in the middle of the city. We're within about 10 minutes of a metro stop. And so it's this really interesting farm right in the middle of the city that we're always keen to have people come and visit.
Mm-hmm. Well, very good, Andy. Thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been an interesting call, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the time. Take care.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes. You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.